performance insufficient for sustained combat against modern interceptors. That's the assessment from a Soviet Naval Aviation Technical Bulletin dated March 1953. The document analyzes American carrier-based fighters operating in Korean waters. The F9F-2 Panther gets 3 paragraphs. Maximum speed 579 miles per hour versus the MiG-15's 668. Rate of climb 5,000 feet per minute versus 9,800. Service ceiling 42,800 feet versus 50,000. The conclusion uses careful language, but the message is clear. The Panther is too slow to matter. The bulletin circulated among Soviet advisors embedded with North Korean and Chinese air units. Standard intelligence distribution. Know your enemy's capabilities. Exploit their weaknesses. The Panther's weaknesses looked obvious on paper. Subsonic in an era when supersonic was coming. Straight wing when swept wings dominated jet design. 4 20mm cannons when the MiG-15 carried 1 37mm and 2 23mm guns with better ballistics. Soviet test pilots had flown captured American aircraft when they could get them. The assessments fed back to design bureaus in Moscow and to tactical training programs at bases across the Soviet Union and client states. The Panther analysis wasn't unique. Every American fighter got similar treatment: strengths, weaknesses, recommended engagement doctrine. What the March 1953 bulletin didn't mention. By that date, Panthers had already shot down multiple MiG-15s in circumstances Soviet doctrine said shouldn't produce American victories. The losses were documented. Soviet naval aviation knew about them. Someone chose not to include that information in the technical assessment, maybe because explaining how a slower aircraft with inferior climb rate kept winning. Turning fights required admitting something about pilot training or tactical doctrine was wrong. The bulletin exists in Russian military archives. Declassified in 2007 when someone at the Defense Ministry decided Korean War technical assessments no longer mattered strategically. A researcher at the Cold War International History Project translated portions. The translation appeared in a 2009 paper about Soviet aviation intelligence practices. 3 paragraphs about the Panther. The researcher noted the document's date, March 1953, and observed that by then the war was nearly over, and American jets had established clear air superiority despite theoretical performance disadvantages. The gap between what Soviet intelligence assessed and what actually happened over Korea matters because it shows up repeatedly in Cold War aviation history. The side with better specifications lost anyway. Not always. Not consistently enough to invalidate performance data completely, but often enough that something else was determining outcomes beyond thrust-to-weight ratios and maximum speed. 4 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons. That's what the Panther carried, mounted in the nose, each gun firing 750 rounds per minute. Total ammunition load 760 rounds, which gave you maybe 15 seconds of continuous fire if you held the trigger down and didn't care about overheating. The cannons were developed during World War II for different aircraft. The Navy adapted them for jets. They worked. Soviet assessments noted the armament, noted the rate of fire, calculated effective range at approximately 1,000 yards maximum. Concluded, the MiG-15's heavier guns had superior hitting power. True enough. A 37mm round does more damage than a 20mm round when it hits. The question was whether it hit. The March 1953 bulletin recommended MiG-15 pilots exploit speed and climb advantages through slashing attacks. Don't turn with Panthers. Don't linger in their gun range. Use your performance envelope. The doctrine was sound. Some pilots followed it. Royce Williams didn't. Neil Armstrong launched from USS Essex on August 29, 1951. His first combat mission. Target was a railroad bridge near Songjin on North Korea's east coast. He was flying an F9F-2 Panther, 21 years old, the youngest pilot in Fighter Squadron 51. He'd joined the Navy in 1949 straight out of high school through a program that paid for college in exchange for service. Purdue University. Aeronautical engineering, then Pensacola for flight training, then Korea. The bridge mission was supposed to be straightforward: low-level attack run, drop ordnance, climb out. The briefing mentioned anti-aircraft fire as the primary threat. Nobody mentioned MiGs because MiGs didn't usually operate that far south during daylight. North Korean Air Force kept their jets near the Yalu River, where they could retreat into Chinese airspace when American fighters showed up. Armstrong's Panther took a hit from a cable strung across the valley, some kind of anti-aircraft barrage balloon setup the intelligence briefings hadn't covered. The cable sheared off 6 feet of his right wing. The aircraft stayed flyable, but barely. He couldn't maintain altitude, couldn't turn properly. The smart move was ejecting over friendly territory before the wing failed completely. He nursed the aircraft 20 miles south to an airfield where a Marine unit was operating. Bailed out over the runway. The Panther crashed. Armstrong walked away. His squadron mates recovered him the next day. That story gets told in Armstrong biographies because it foreshadows his later career as a test pilot who stayed calm when things broke. But it's not the story that matters here. What matters is that Fighter Squadron 51 kept flying Panthers for 2 more years after Armstrong's bridge mission. They flew interdiction strikes, close air support, combat air patrol over the carrier battle group. They encountered MiGs. Sometimes the MiGs engaged, sometimes they didn't. The engagement record from VF-51's deployment shows 8 confirmed MiG kills between 1951 and 1953. All 8 were MiG-15s. All 8 were shot down by F9F Panthers that Soviet assessments said couldn't compete. Armstrong never got a MiG kill himself. He flew 78 combat missions total. Most were ground attack. He earned 3 air medals, standard recognition for completing missions under fire. Nothing extraordinary happened during most of his sorties. That's how carrier aviation worked. You launched, you hit your target, or you didn't. You came back. You did it again the next day until your deployment ended. But other pilots in his squadron were fighting MiGs and winning despite flying an aircraft that Moscow's technical analysts had dismissed as inadequate. The pattern wasn't unique to VF-51. Other Panther squadrons reported similar results. The Navy compiled the data. Somewhere in operational files, the statistics existed. Panthers versus MiG-15s. Win-loss ratios. Engagement circumstances. That analysis either confirmed the Panther could hold its own in jet combat or it didn't. The Navy kept flying them either way. Built 1382 Panthers between 1947 and 1953. Grumman's production line in Bethpage, New York. The straight wing design looked obsolete the moment swept wing jets appeared, but the Navy had carriers that needed fighters, and the Panther worked well enough for carrier operations. Slow, stable, predictable handling during landing approaches. Those characteristics mattered more than maximum speed when you're trying to catch a wire on a pitching deck at night. Armstrong left the Navy in 1952, went back to Purdue, finished his degree, became a test pilot. The rest is different history. His Panther missions in Korea were footnotes. Brief service in a war that ended ambiguously. He never talked much about it in interviews. When asked about Korea, he'd confirm basic facts and move on to topics that interested him more. Royce Williams grew up in Wilmot, South Dakota. Population 412. His father ran a general store. Williams learned to hunt at age 8 because that's what you did in rural South Dakota during the Depression. Shooting moving targets with a rifle, leading the target, accounting for wind. Those skills transferred to different contexts later, but nobody thinks about pheasant hunting when they're watching dogfighting MiGs at 12,000 feet over the Sea of Japan. He graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1945, joined the Navy, flew Corsairs off carriers in the Pacific Theater during the final months of World War II. Never saw combat. The war ended before his squadron deployed to the combat zone. He stayed in the Navy afterward, transitioned to jets, F9F Panthers. By November 1952, he was attached to Fighter Squadron 781 aboard USS Oriskany operating in Korean waters. The mission on November 18th was combat air patrol, 4 Panthers, standard defensive screen protecting the carrier battle group from air attack. Williams was section leader. The weather was terrible. Low clouds, poor visibility, surface temperature near freezing. The kind of day where you fly the patrol because it's on the schedule and hope nothing happens, because fighting in these conditions violates everything the training manuals recommend. The radar controller on Oriskany called out contacts at 11:47 hours. Multiple bogies inbound from the north. Fast. The other 3 Panthers in Williams's section were experiencing radio failures or fuel issues. The details conflict across different reports. What's clear is that Williams ended up alone when 7 MiG-15s appeared out of the cloud layer. 7 Soviet naval aviation fighters. Not North Korean, not Chinese, Soviet, flying from bases in Vladivostok. Their mission was presumably reconnaissance or harassment of American carrier operations. Finding a single Panther instead of a 4-plane section changed the tactical situation in their favor. 7 versus 1. The performance advantage the MiG-15 already had over the Panther, multiplied by numerical superiority, should have made the engagement one-sided. Williams turned into them. That decision gets analyzed in naval aviation tactical studies even now. The smart move was running for the carrier's defensive umbrella. Call for help. Extend away using whatever speed advantage you could generate in a dive. Survive. Instead, he committed to a turning fight against 7 aircraft that could outclimb him and outrun him in every flight regime. The engagement lasted 35 minutes. Williams fired all his ammunition. 4 MiGs went down confirmed by gun camera footage and radar tracking. Possibly 6. 2 others were damaged enough that they broke off and headed back towards Soviet airspace trailing smoke. The surviving MiGs disengaged around 12:22 hours. Williams recovered to Oriskany with his Panther shot full of holes and fuel leaking from the wings. His wingman eventually showed up. Radio fixed or fuel situation resolved. Too late to help, but early enough to see the aftermath. Gun camera footage showed the kills. Navy intelligence watched it, then classified the entire engagement. Williams got the Silver Star. The citation was vague. Extraordinary heroism during flight operations. Nothing about shooting down 4 Soviet fighters because acknowledging Soviet naval aviation was engaging American carrier aircraft over international waters created diplomatic problems nobody wanted in November 1952, while armistice negotiations were ongoing. The gun camera footage sat in classified archives for 40 years. The Navy knew what happened. Soviet naval aviation knew because 4 of their pilots didn't come home. The engagement just never got discussed publicly until declassification in the 1990s made it impossible to ignore anymore. Williams went back to flying routine patrols. The war ended 7 months later. He stayed in the Navy. Retired as a captain in 1980, lived in California. Died in 2020 at age 97. The Colt Mark 12 cannon fires a 20mm round at 2,750 feet per second muzzle velocity. Each projectile weighs 4.4 ounces. The high-explosive incendiary variant carried a small bursting charge that detonated on impact. Not enough explosive to destroy an aircraft outright. Just enough to fragment the casing and send shrapnel through whatever the round penetrated. MiG-15 construction used aluminum alloys for most of the airframe. Duralumin specifically. Soviet designation D16T. Similar composition to American 2024 aluminum. The skin thickness varied by location. Fuselage panels ran about 0.8 millimeters. Wing surfaces slightly thicker, control surfaces thinner. The structure was light because jet fighters needed to be light to achieve the performance numbers that mattered. Climb rate, turn rate, acceleration. 20mm rounds punched through 0.8mm aluminum like it wasn't there. The question was what they hid inside. Fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, engine components, control linkages. The MiG-15 had redundant systems for some things, single points of failure for others. Hit the right spot and the aircraft stopped flying. Hit the wrong spot and you just made holes. Williams put rounds into the right spots 4 times during 35 minutes of maneuvering combat. The gun camera footage shows the hits. Stills were published decades later in naval aviation journals. One frame shows a MiG-15 with visible impacts along the left wing route. Another shows fire trailing from an engine section. Another shows structural failure in progress. wings separating. The high-explosive incendiary rounds worked exactly as designed. Soviet engineers had tested their aluminum alloys against various projectile types during development. That's standard practice. You need to know what your aircraft can survive. I found references to ballistic testing in a declassified CIA technical analysis from 1955 that examined captured MiG-15 components. The testing showed D-16T aluminum could resist certain calibers under specific conditions. The conditions didn't include high rate of fire cannon strikes at close range from multiple angles during violent maneuvering. Temperature affects aluminum properties. At minus 10 degrees Celsius, the material becomes slightly more brittle. At minus 20, it gets worse. The Sea of Japan in November has surface temperatures around 12 degrees Celsius. Air temperature at 12,000 feet was probably minus 15 to minus 20. Whether that affected the MiG's structural integrity during the engagement is something I thought about for longer than makes sense. The CIA analysis mentions temperature sensitivity. Notes that Soviet cold weather testing focused on airframe stress in level flight, not combat maneuvering. Then moves on to different topics. That's all I have. The Panthers that Williams flew had the same aluminum construction vulnerability. 23mm rounds from a MiG-15's cannon would shred a Panther just as effectively as 20mm rounds shredded MiGs. The difference wasn't materials. Both sides were building jets from similar alloys using similar construction techniques. The difference was who got hits first and where those hits landed. Williams got hits first, 4 times. His ammunition load was 760 rounds total across 4 guns. Gun camera analysis estimated he fired approximately 680 rounds during the engagement. That's 170 rounds per kill if you divide evenly, which is meaningless because combat doesn't work that way. Some targets took 50 rounds, some took 300. The ammunition expenditure data exists in the after-action analysis. The distribution pattern across individual targets doesn't. What survives is confirmation that 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons firing high-explosive incendiary ammunition could reliably destroy MiG-15s when employed by a pilot who could consistently put rounds on target during high-G maneuvering combat. Soviet technical assessments had the ballistic data. They just didn't account for Williams. Soviet naval aviation loss reports from November 1952 use passive voice exclusively when describing aircraft destroyed over the Sea of Japan. Contact was lost with interceptor elements. Aircraft failed to return to base. Radio communication ceased during engagement with enemy forces. Never Lieutenant Sokolov was shot down. Never Captain Ivanov's MiG disintegrated after taking cannon fire. Just passive constructions that obscure who died and how. The reports were declassified in batches starting in 2001 when Russian military archives opened portions of their Korean War documentation to researchers. Translation quality varies. Some documents got professional treatment through academic institutions. Others were machine translated, and the syntax is barely comprehensible. But the pattern holds across all of them. Passive voice. Neutral language. No assignment of responsibility for losses beyond vague references to enemy action. One report from November 20th, 1952, describes the loss of 4 aircraft during routine patrol operations in international airspace. The date is 2 days after Williams's engagement. The location matches. 4 aircraft lost matches the confirmed kills. The report notes that weather conditions were suboptimal for visual combat, and that American fighters demonstrated unanticipated tactical proficiency. That last phrase appears 3 times in 2 pages. Unanticipated tactical proficiency. Not superior aircraft. Not better weapons. Tactical proficiency that Soviet intelligence hadn't anticipated. The phrasing matters because it shifts blame away from equipment performance or strategic planning onto intelligence failure. Someone didn't anticipate that American pilots could fight effectively in conditions Soviet doctrine assumed would favor the defender. Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force records from the same period use different language. They name pilots killed in action. They specify aircraft types and weapons that caused losses. They assign blame when tactical errors led to unnecessary casualties. The Chinese were documenting lessons learned. The Soviets were documenting bureaucratic compliance with reporting requirements while avoiding any language that might trigger investigations into command responsibility. Soviet naval aviation wasn't supposed to be engaging American carrier aircraft in November 1952. The war was winding down. Armistice negotiations were ongoing. Direct Soviet military involvement was officially non-existent. Soviet pilots flew with North Korean or Chinese markings when they operated over Korea. The fiction was maintained in diplomatic channels, even though American intelligence knew exactly who was flying those MiGs based on intercept tactics and radio procedures. Finding 4 Soviet naval aviation fighters meant someone had authorized a mission that violated the operational parameters Moscow had established for avoiding direct confrontation with American forces. The passive voice in the loss reports obscures that decision chain. No mission authorization is referenced. No commander is named as having ordered the patrol. The aircraft were just lost during routine operations that weren't supposed to be happening. A researcher at the Russian State Military Archive mentioned in a 2008 interview that personnel files for Soviet naval aviation pilots killed in Korea remain restricted. The interview appeared in a Russian military history journal. He said the restrictions weren't classified in the traditional sense. The files just weren't cataloged for public access. Nobody had bothered to process them because nobody was asking for them. Maybe that's changed. Maybe not. Williams's engagement appears in American naval aviation history as the most successful jet versus jet combat of the Korean War. It appears in Soviet records as a bureaucratic notation about contact lost with 4 aircraft during weather conditions unsuitable for operations. Both versions describe the same 35 minutes. The difference is who's writing the report and what they're willing to say about what happened. The 4 Soviet pilots who didn't come home had families. They had service records. They had funerals, presumably. Those details exist somewhere in archives that researchers either can't access or haven't bothered to look through yet. The Navy flew Panthers until 1958. 6 years after Williams shot down 4 MiGs in an aircraft Soviet assessments said couldn't compete. By 1958, the F9F-2 Cougar variant had replaced most Panthers in fleet squadrons. Swept wings, better performance. Still subsonic but faster than the straight-wing models. The Cougar was essentially a redesigned Panther with aerodynamic improvements that addressed some of the speed disadvantage. But even after swept-wing jets became standard, training squadrons kept flying straight-wing Panthers because the aircraft handled predictably, and new pilots needed predictable handling characteristics while learning carrier operations. Landing on a carrier at night in bad weather is difficult enough without adding swept-wing quirks to the equation. The Panther was stable, forgiving. It didn't kill student pilots at the rates some other jets did. Grumman kept proposing Panther variants through the mid-1950s. Attack versions with heavier ordnance capacity. Photo reconnaissance models with camera packages. All-weather interceptors with radar systems. Some got built in limited numbers. Most stayed on drawing boards because the Navy was transitioning to supersonic fighters and didn't want to invest in evolutionary improvements to subsonic platforms. Here's where I got carried away. The engineering reports from Grumman's Design Bureau between 1953 and 1956 are fascinating if you're interested in how aircraft companies try to keep production lines running when their primary product is becoming obsolete. Grumman knew swept wings were the future. They'd already designed the Cougar, but the Panther production tooling was paid for, and the workers knew how to build it, and shutting down the line meant laying off skilled labor you might need later. So, they pitched variants. Incremental improvements. The F9F-6 added wingtip fuel tanks. The F9F-7 used a different engine. None of these changes address the fundamental limitation that straight wings can't go supersonic. But they kept the production line active while Grumman transitioned to newer designs. The Navy bought small batches of each variant, enough to sustain production, but not enough to suggest they viewed the Panther as a long-term solution. The last Panthers retired from active fleet service in 1958. Reserve squadrons flew them into the early 1960s, Then they went to storage at Davis-Monthan or got scrapped or became instructional airframes at technical schools where mechanics learned to work on jet engines using obsolete fighters that wouldn't be missed if someone made mistakes. That's probably too much detail about post-Korea Panther variants, when the point is just that the Navy kept flying an aircraft that performed worse on paper than its adversaries because it worked well enough in practice. The transition to better aircraft took time, procurement cycles, budget authorizations, training pipelines. You don't replace an entire fleet overnight just because something faster exists. And the Panthers kept proving they could fight when required. The Korean War kill-loss ratios showed it. Williams proved it definitively. 4 MiG-15s in one engagement. Soviet performance assessments couldn't explain that without acknowledging their predictions had missed something important about how air combat actually worked versus how specifications suggested it should work. By 1958, when the last Panthers left fleet service, the jet that Soviet advisors had dismissed as too slow to matter had accumulated a combat record that matched or exceeded more advanced designs. Not through superior performance, through adequate performance combined with pilot training that Soviet analysts hadn't properly accounted for when they wrote their technical bulletins about American fighter capabilities. The March 1953 bulletin was correct about the numbers: maximum speed, climb rate, service ceiling. All the performance metrics favored the MiG-15. The bulletin was wrong about what those numbers meant in combat. The Office of Naval Intelligence classified Williams' engagement report immediately after he landed on Oriskany, standard procedure for anything involving Soviet forces. The Cold War operated under specific rules. American and Soviet aircraft could fight each other. Everyone knew it happened. But officially acknowledging it created diplomatic complications neither side wanted while armistice negotiations were still ongoing in Korea. Williams gave his debriefing to the squadron intelligence officer within hours of landing. The debriefing transcript runs 14 pages. Most of it is technical details: engagement geometry, ammunition expenditure, observed enemy tactics. The intelligence officer asked specific questions about the MiG's performance characteristics. How did they maneuver? What were their attack patterns? Did they coordinate effectively or operate independently? Williams answered everything he could remember. The gun camera footage went to photo interpretation specialists aboard Oriskany. They counted the hits, confirmed 4 kills. Assessed 2 additional MiGs as probably destroyed based on visible damage and flight behavior before they disappeared into cloud cover. The assessment noted that Williams had engaged 7 aircraft simultaneously for 35 minutes and survived without taking catastrophic damage. The final line recommended immediate classification of all materials related to the engagement. Why the Navy kept it classified for 4 decades has multiple explanations depending on which source you trust. The official explanation after declassification in 1995 emphasized protecting intelligence sources and methods. Revealing the engagement would confirm to Soviet intelligence how much American radar and communications intercept capabilities had advanced. Possible. Naval intelligence was monitoring Soviet radio traffic and tracking aircraft movements with systems they didn't want to expose. Another explanation focuses on diplomatic considerations. The engagement occurred in international airspace, but close enough to Soviet territorial waters that Moscow could claim American fighters had provoked the confrontation. Publicly acknowledging that a single Navy pilot shot down 4 Soviet aircraft might force Moscow to respond, escalate tensions. Better to let both sides maintain the fiction that their forces weren't directly engaging each other. The third explanation is simpler. The engagement made American carrier aviation look good and Soviet naval aviation look incompetent. Naval intelligence wanted to preserve that information advantage. If Soviet commanders didn't fully understand why they'd lost 4 aircraft that day, they might make the same tactical mistakes again. Publishing Williams's success would force Soviet doctrine revisions that would make future engagements harder. All 3 explanations probably contributed. Bureaucracies rarely classify information for just one reason. Williams didn't talk about it publicly until after declassification. He gave interviews then because historians kept asking, and the official secrecy was lifted. He described the engagement factually. No embellishment. He acknowledged getting lucky multiple times when MiG pilots made positioning errors he could exploit. He credited his gunnery training. He noted that 35 minutes is an extremely long dogfight, and most of that time was defensive maneuvering, trying not to get shot while waiting for opportunities to shoot back. One interview from 1998 asked him if he thought about the Soviet pilots who died. He said yes. He thought about it during the fight when he was trying not to become one of them. He thought about it afterward when the adrenaline wore off and he had time to process what had happened. Then he went back to flying routine patrols because that was the job. That answer appears in multiple interview transcripts. He was consistent about it. The Silver Star's citation remained vague, even after declassification. The Navy could have amended it to include specific details. They didn't. The citation still just says, extraordinary heroism during flight operations. You have to know the context to understand what that meant. A Soviet Naval Aviation Training Directive dated April 1954 includes revised engagement protocols for encounters with American carrier aircraft. The document is 8 pages. Most of it covers standard intercept procedures that hadn't changed since 1951. But page 6 has a paragraph about F9F type aircraft that uses different language than earlier assessments. The paragraph notes that American carrier fighters have demonstrated combat effectiveness beyond initial performance projections, and recommends Soviet pilots avoid sustained turning engagements regardless of numerical advantage. That's a significant revision from the March 1953 bulletin that dismissed Panthers as too slow to matter. Someone between November 1952 and April 1954 decided the previous assessment needed correcting. The directive doesn't mention Williams specifically, doesn't reference the November 18th engagement, just acknowledges that F9F aircraft are more dangerous in combat than specifications suggested they should be. The phrasing is careful, doesn't admit Soviet pilots made tactical errors, doesn't acknowledge that 4 fighters got shot down by 1 Panther, just notes that combat effectiveness exceeded projections and recommends revised tactics. After April 1954, the references to Panthers in Soviet training materials drop off. Later directives from 1955 and 1956 focus on swept-wing American jets. F9F Cougars, F7 U Cutlasses, F3 H Demons. The straight-wing Panther disappears from the threat assessments, not because it stopped being a threat, because by 1955, American carriers were deploying newer aircraft and Soviet doctrine focused on current threats rather than yesterday's fighters. The April 1954 directive is the last Soviet document I found that discusses F9F combat tactics in detail. Everything after that treats the Panther as a historical footnote. Training materials moved on. Intelligence assessments moved on. The lessons learned from losing 4 MiG-15s to 1 Panther got absorbed into general fighter combat doctrine without specific attribution. Whether Soviet naval aviation ever conducted a thorough analysis of what went wrong on November 18, 1952, is something I can't determine from available records. The loss report used passive voice. The training directive acknowledged combat effectiveness exceeded expectations. Between those 2 documents is a gap where the actual tactical analysis should exist. Investigation reports, debriefings of surviving pilots, assessments of why 7 aircraft couldn't defeat 1 opponent with inferior performance specifications. That analysis either doesn't exist or it remains in archives that researchers haven't accessed. Russian military historians I contacted through academic channels said personnel files and tactical investigation reports from the Korean War period are unevenly cataloged. Some material is available, some isn't. Requests for specific documents sometimes succeed and sometimes disappear into bureaucratic processing for years. The Panther's combat record in Korea is documented thoroughly on the American side. Kill confirmations, gun camera footage, after-action reports. Naval historians can reconstruct most major engagements in detail. The Soviet side has fragments. loss reports that avoid specifics, training directives that acknowledge problems without explaining them, gaps where the analysis should be. Williams died in 2020, 97 years old. Natural causes. His obituary in Navy Times mentioned his Korean War service and his later career. It noted he'd shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a single engagement, but didn't specify they were Soviet. The phrasing was vague enough that casual readers might assume they were North Korean or Chinese. Old habits about classification and diplomatic sensitivity die slowly even when the information has been public for decades. The gun camera footage from November 18, 1952 exists somewhere in Navy archives, declassified. Accessible theoretically. I've never watched it. Just read descriptions from people who have. 4 MiG-15s destroyed, 35 minutes, one F9F Panther that Soviet advisors said was too slow to win that fight.